African Origins with Dr. Asa G. Hilliard III, the Fuller E. Callaway Professor of Urban Education at Georgia State University. In parts 1 and 2, we examined how product packaging was used to poke fun at and belittle the African American. We also showed you how various forms of media, scholarly books, newspapers, television, movies, and radio, converged upon the black mind to destroy it. Of course, you were compelled to ask the question, why was the white mind so obsessed with the need to create a perverted African personality? In this segment, we turn our attention to the birthplace of humanity. We will show you how the parents of mankind may have looked. We will also learn something about the black skin. We will see that far from being an aberration, an abnormality, as the minstrels period believed, the black skin is man before mutation and other biological processes set in. But first, we conclude for now our examination of how negative images impact on the mind through subliminal seduction.
There are people who have written books about this, especially the medium, the TV medium. Subliminal seduction would be a case in point. For example, on the cover of that book, the word sex is written in the ice cubes on the glass, and it's subliminally received but not really received, and that's one of the ways to attract
word
it.
Sex
It actually appears as shadows in the ice cubes in the glass.
Now, how does the mind work with that? Can you explain that?
Yes, that I've had it demonstrated to me with an old movie where there must be 20 years old that they've known about how you could easily influence people to lean in the direction of certain information by flashing subliminal images on TV. In this case, trying to help a person determine whether another one was thinking of a triangle, a square, or I think in a rectangle, a circle, a square, and a triangle. I guess that's what they were talking about. So I'm thinking of one of these things. What is it? And I found myself saying triangle. And then the guy backed it up. He said, most people said triangle. He backed the film up. He said, most people said triangle. Now let me show you why you said triangle. And what was happening was when the instructions were being given on the film, the triangle was flashing fast enough for me to pick it up with my brain, but not with my eyes.
Ah,
okay. And so I actually got the message and didn't know where it had come from or even that I had gotten it. And I actually had done exactly what he said.
So is the subliminal message more powerful at times than the obvious, the overt?
Well, I've heard people say that. I wish I were expert enough to know in detail what that's all about. But I suspect that it may be more powerful than the actual message. And
because you're not even aware.
Because people aren't aware of what's coming at them. So this means that we have to educate a whole generation, especially if you have the capacity to manipulate images consciously, and if you have the history of having done so intentionally, then it becomes critical that the people who are victimized by this most become critical viewers. And you only become critical viewers by being aware of it. Remember, your mind cannot be programmed if you are aware that someone may be trying to program your mind. Okay. Now, look at the images that we get just by contrast for white males. This is just some of the images that we get. And try to imagine anything by way of comparison for a black male. See, Gary Cooper. We don't have a black Gary Cooper, that's popular. Marlon Brando. See? Even now, they have a white female Tarzan. Her name is Sheena. So, so with women's liberation, white women now get to go over and do to Africans what Tarzan did.
What is that? What should that say to black women, black people?
Well, it ought to raise some questions about what liberation means, and what true liberation is. And of course, we have to make the strongest possible commitment to that. But we cannot be misled by people who have commitment to what I call pseudo liberation.
Okay.
And here's, again, the summation of this whole section, I think, in this one picture, are black children using only half a brain. And here we have the gaze at this Superman image, which is what is projected for other populations, and the degraded image of black people being projected. What does a young black child who has not been in the old world have to grow on, to feed the mind, to program the mind? And then we begin to see the danger and why it is necessary to do the kind of thing that I intend to do in sharing with you a corrected version of the history of African and African American people. See, these images were missing. You never saw any of them in what I presented to you. You didn't see the image of Nkrumah, of Garvey, of Lumumba, of Malcolm. These are strong, brilliant images, images that our children need to know about, but images that they did not know about. So let's correct the picture. That's the bad news, you see, what I just showed. Now let's talk about the good news. The good news is that if we were to try to tell the story of Africa's people, and therefore the story of African American people, we would have to begin at the beginning of time, at the beginning of human time on the face of the earth. Because at that time, there was only one people on the face of the earth, and they were all Africans. Because for the first 5 million years of hominid existence on the face of the earth, all of them, well, for the first 4 million of 5 million years, people were all located in the continent of Africa. There was no other continent that was populated. And they were basically the same biological stock. That's what paleontologists and others who study these things tell us. And as Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop has shown, that there were 6 types of hominids that ultimately developed on the continent of Africa, and 3 developed only there. 2 types of Australopithecines, Australopithecus, who I will show, Homo habilis, Homo erectus, Neanderthal, and Homo sapiens sapiens. Those were the ones that developed first on the continent of Africa. The last 3 left the continent of Africa to populate the rest of the world. And Homo sapiens sapiens, who we are, and I'll show a picture of that, was the one that started in Africa then and branched out and became the race, what we now call the races of mankind. So what I'm saying is that not only is Africa's story the story of the people that we now call Africans and African Americans, but Africa's story is also the human story in its original form. So Cradle of Humanity is the part that we want to take a look at. Stephen Gould, who wrote the book The Mismeasure of Man, a Harvard professor, wrote an essay about why is it that anthropologists, paleontologists, others began to look so hard for the origin of humankind in Asia. You know, he spent a long time looking for it in Europe, and of course you couldn't get bones old enough to explain human evolution in Europe. So they had another choice, which was go to the Asian continent or to the African continent. And almost in the face of overwhelming evidence for years until recently, the commitment was to make certain that the human origin was found in Asia, not in Africa. But in the last few years, the case is almost closed. I mean, there's just no data at this point to support the origin of human being anywhere else in the world. So as Gould said in this article, the first man stood on his feet in Africa, not in Asia. There is a distortion in the way that information is presented about the physical world that parallels the distortion that information is presented about everything else in the world. And this is an example here. If we just took the map of the world, a world map, the one that we usually see when you take a flat map that represents a round surface is the map that you see on the bottom. You see there's 2 maps of the world, one on the bottom and one on the top. That's called a Mercator projection. In other words, you have to distort your map. You have to distort the actual features on the ground in order to represent a globe on a flat surface. If you take the top map, you have less distortion of the ground features. If you take that map, the Peters projection, when you spread out that globe on a flat piece of paper, you should draw a map like the one on the top.
The difference being? The
difference being that the one on the top has Africa in relationship to Europe in much greater size. In other words, Africa really is much, much, much larger than Europe. But look at the one on the bottom. Europe looks almost as big as Africa. Now, you say that's a small thing, but if someone is that distorted on geological features that can be clearly plotted, you know, you can imagine what happens when you begin to play with words and images. Now, the map on the top has been adopted by UNESCO, the United Nations General Educational Organization, sponsored the development of the Peters projection, the map on the top. The map on the bottom, of course, is the one that we prefer to use in the schools to miseducate both black and white children. And so white children grow up with an exaggerated impression of just the physical size of their land.
So how does the term minority figure into all this?
Of course, the term minority is a weird example of perceptual distortion, which is remember, it's one of my neurotic dynamics. It's perceptual distortion because the people that are called minorities are not. You know, like, for example, black people are the majority in the world. And especially if you count African blacks, the most recent African blacks, anywhere in the world. First place, you couldn't count them only on the continent of Africa. A couple 100 million people on the continent of Africa. 60 million of them are in Brazil. That's the largest Africoid population outside the continent of Africa right now. 30 million in the United States. You go to India, there's a large African population in India called Dravidians. And there are African populations that spread out through the Pacific and so forth. So how can you, when you add all those up, how do they come out to be a minority? It's only in the sense of the United States boundaries that you could say that this is an ethnic minority group, but it's not minor in the sense that it's small or unimportant, only to the extent that African Americans fail to connect themselves to their own cultural and historical geological
As the world becomes
tradition.
more global-minded,
Yeah.
what do you think the implication will be for minority then?
Well, it depends on whether or not people are able to see clearly who they are. You know, that if a West Indian thinks of himself as beginning with slavery, which is basically when the West Indian was populated with black folk, largely populated with black folk, and he doesn't see his antecedents, then he can't see his connections to African Americans, for example. So if he just sees himself as, you know, the most that you can say about me is I'm a Jamaican or West Indian, or if an African American says, well, you know, the most you can say about me is I'm a Negro or black, then he doesn't see his connection to the Afro-Brazilian. And for that, and then may indeed begin, it's not, well, there's two things. One, to disconnect himself or herself from natural kinds of alliances. And secondly, and most important, and this is really the important piece, to disconnect oneself from one's historical and cultural antecedents. That is, to me, modern insanity.
Okay.
Yes. Okay. Okay, let's correct the picture. 175 million years ago, according to geologists, this is kind of a map of the world, and notice Africa was the center of the world's land masses. They explained that by continental drift, Africa becomes still the center of the land masses, but the continents begin to form. And that last picture was about 50 million years ago, and then it's about 5 million years ago that we begin to get hominids on the planet, which is relatively recent in time terms, that you've had human-like creatures. That's what hominids means. This particular issue of National Geographic is very special. It's one of the first times that they've summed up information that leads you to two inescapable conclusions that are important for our discussion. This is the November 1985 issue of National Geographic. One of the things that's said in there, and this is one conclusion summed up by the data, today Africa is recognized as the very cradle of the human race. In other words, as far as any information that we have now, it's overwhelmingly clear that all human beings on the face of the earth today originally were Africans. Now that, it's important. It's said by National Geographic, you know, something that someone respects. And that's one issue.
Spoken.
And properly spoken. Yeah. There's a second conclusion that's also hidden in the article, and I captured it here. Skin color was probably dark, an evolutionary adaptation to the tropical sun. Well, we know that the probably is an understatement, that skin color had to be dark. And when you, there's just no history of a white tropical population anywhere in the world. In fact, what we see and call color in human beings is merely the adaptation, the biological adaptation of people to the kinds of climatic and food conditions that they have. And so Africans, in order to live in the heat and with the penetrating rays of the sun, must be pigmented, or else they will be unhealthy or die. That would be a disadvantage, for example, at the North Pole, that same pigment. Whereas whites, in order to live at the North Pole or in northern climates during the geological periods of the Ice Age, found a way to adapt that allowed them to get vitamin D from the sun by reduction in pigment. Those who reduced their pigment lived. Those who maintained it didn't do so well. So now if you shift those populations around, then they will each be in the wrong environment biologically until such time as they could hopefully find a way to adapt. So we know that Glodger's law in biology, cited by Dr. Diop, says that in the tropics that warm-blooded animals secrete pigment as a means for doing a lot of things we won't go into now because you don't want to show on pigmentation, but there's a lot to be said about melanin and the functions that it serves. But one function that it serves is the protective coloration that allows energy from the sun to be literally transformed and absorbed without creating any harmful effect on black people. So we know that these early species were indeed black.
Now, in a non-racist world,
Yeah,
people might say, so what?
yeah.
But
Why is that important?
But today,
Right. The reason, in a non-racist world, we probably wouldn't even have to have this particular segment, or at least maybe not even the show,
right,
in a non-racist world. The problem goes back to those manipulation of images that I've said. That what has been said about black people is by the world's great historian Toynbee, Africa is the only, black people are the only group of people on the face of the earth that never created a civilization. That was said by one of the great scholars of the world. Hegel said Africa is no part of human history. Anything that we see in Africa that's historical belongs to the Asiatic or European world. That what we see in Africa as historical is in Egypt, and that it doesn't belong to Africa. That what we know of Africa belongs to the underdeveloped spirit still on the threshold of human history.
I get back to this question.
That's Hegel.
I get back to this question again,
Yes.
and that is, and I don't expect you to have the answer, but I'm going to ask it.
Yeah.
Once again, here you see the assault
Yes.
on the black mind, black intelligence,
Yes.
black historical whatever. What is the reason for this? What was and what is?
Oh, it's clear what the reason is. It goes back to the fact that,
Whereas, getting
Yeah.
back in there, you said earlier that initially they looked at Europe as a source
yes,
or as the origin
yes,
of mankind. But then they said, well, the bones
couldn't
weren't
find
old
the
enough
evidence.
here.
Couldn't find the
So they
evidence.
said, well, let's go to Asia.
that's right.
All right.
They went back.
Why was it that Asia was more acceptable
than black?
than black? Yeah.
Well, I mixed up the answer with the question.
Okay.
That Asia was closer to white, and that by that time you realize that these studies of the origins of humankind are really studies that have taken place after the slavery period. And so you've had 400 years of trying to justify the enslavement of the African. That's the population that was enslaved. So it's the children of the enslavers who have spent this time with protecting the justification, and sometimes subliminally. Sometimes they don't even know that's what they're doing. But they inherited an opinion about black people that they continue to attempt to justify through scientific means.
Okay.
Which wasn't true of Asian because they weren't an enslaved population.
Okay.
It's important to call attention to the fact that if we look at this picture, that's one of the Leakeys. That's Richard Leakey on the right, the son of the great Leakey, and they're the discoverers of the, or at least they are leaders of expeditions to uncover these bones of hominids in East Africa, where they are most plentiful. But there's also on the left, Kimoy Kimu. I think I'm pronouncing it right. And I think it's important to give credit to these Africans who find the bones. Most people show the Leakeys, but never show the people who find the bones. And this is one of the greatest finders of old bones. They say he has an uncanny knack for finding bones in these places where it looks like there's nothing but rocks. And there are others, such as those on the hominid gang, Africans who themselves are uncovering the bones of their ancestors, but the credit doesn't usually go to them. So that's why I wanted to have this picture with both Callaway, Camus, and Leakey together as they.
Callaway and his assistant.
Yes, and his assistant. That's true. Now, let's look at what they're finding. Note the map of Africa and the places where most of the major finds occur, and you'll notice that it's around the middle of East Africa that most of the major finds occur. That's very important. It's in the East African part, and it's also in the South African part that you get all of the bones of early man for the first couple million years of this 5 million year period. They don't appear anywhere else, nowhere else in the world. In fact, they never leave the continent until 1 million years ago, when they left, one group of them left the continent and went to Asia. Now let's see what we're talking about them. We're talking about Australopithecus gracile. We're talking about Australopithecus robustus. We're talking about Homo habilis. Those 3 species never left the continent of Africa, the ones that I just showed you. They are found only on the continent of Africa. That brings us up to about 2 million years ago. Then we have the ones that did get off the continent of Africa. That's this one, which is Homo erectus, and you'll find them in Asia about 1 million years ago. You don't find them in Europe until 500,000 years ago, and at that point you're getting Neanderthal, which is this one. This is the bone of Neanderthal. And then finally, about 130,000 years ago, Homo sapiens sapien, that's modern man, modern woman, were found in the continent of Africa. We can take them back fairly reliably with different types of dating techniques to at least 110,000 years ago. Some people suggest it may be more like 150,000 years ago in Africa. And it's that group of people who, like all the other 5, left down the Nile River, really down the Nile River, going down north. Remember, the Nile flows from the south to the north, and then the land bridge to Asia, and then eventually, about 500,000 years ago, will come into the European continent. Remember, America doesn't even figure in this at all, north or south, until about 12, 13,000 years ago. So this is Homo sapiens sapien. Now let's look at what happens when you put skin and bones on. You try to recreate what they look like from the bones. This is Time magazine, and this is Richard Leakey again, and that's Homo habilis. That's one of the ones that never left. Homo habilis stayed on the continent of Africa. But look at what Homo habilis looks like. It had to be pigmented and dark skin. This is important because of the argument that has been made about the first, the argument that said God created man in 5 different places, or 4 different places. It created, they had a separate creation. There was a European creation, an Asian creation, an African creation. Well, biology and polygenetic theory is no longer any support for that. You know, there's only a monogenetic theory. We come from one source. African Eve is the source of humankind. And so this is an example of what happens through forensic methods when there's an attempt to put the skin, you know, there are techniques of taking a skeleton and with fine measurements determining what the facial features would have looked like if it had skin on it. That's what I mean by forensic methods. Okay. And this is what happened with the Time magazine issue. Now, one wonders why this next thing happened, but it did happen. You're looking at a picture of Piltdown Man. And what happened here was that after these bones kept being dug up in Africa, and it's showing more clearly an African origin every day, one day they found Piltdown Man in Europe. And Piltdown Man outside of England was supposed to be about 250,000 years old. It turned out for 30 years the scientific establishment accepted this as truth, when in fact this was a total hoax. Piltdown Man was a human skull with a orangutan's jaw that had been treated with chemicals and buried in the ground to make it appear that it was about 250,000 years old. And now you can read about Piltdown Man in the encyclopedia. I took this particular one from the World Book Encyclopedia, which showed that the whole establishment was fooled. Apparently they wanted to believe in this hoax because it would have given Europe its own antiquity, its own independent antiquity, an antiquity independent of Asia, independent of Africa, and so forth. But it's been shown to be a total lie. Now, what we've said is Africa is the cradle of humankind, and we've said that that took place over a period of about 5 million years. Now what's more important, though, because you can say, well, fine, you know, Australopithecus grizzly, what's that got to do with Jasper Smith in Harlem? It's got nothing to do. Well, let's get closer to the time where we get concerned not so much about who the people were, but what they did. And the thing that seems to set people off in terms of their respect, the respect that they receive in the world, is the degree to which they participate in and create civilization. And so that's why the third part of my presentation here has to do with not only the fact that Africa was the cradle of the human species, but Africa was the cradle of civilization itself. In other words, African, meaning black African people, created the world's first civilization.
Hold on.